You don't hire a human because you want a bodyguard. You hire a human because you want a walking extinction event. The galactic community classifies Earth as a Class 9 Deathworld, a rock where the gravity crushes bone, the microbes eat metal, and the apex predators kill for sport. Diana didn't know that. She just saw a quiet man sitting in the corner of a mercenary bar, nursing a cheap synthetic whiskey. He looked exhausted. She should have asked what made him so tired. The air inside the rusted orbital station tasted like recycled sweat and burnt ozone. Diana hated the lower wards. She hated the flickering neon that hummed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. And she hated the way the shadows seemed to lean inward, eager to swallow anyone who walked too slowly. But when her own board of directors put a bounty on her head, she stopped caring about ambiance. Until 3 days ago, Diana was the sole heir to the interstellar shipping empire her father had built. Then his transport shuttle suffered a sudden, inexplicable reactor failure over a dead moon. Now she was a liability. The corporate security force had already tried to quietly suffocate her in her sleep. Her personal guards, 3 hulking reptilians from a high-gravity core world, had been bought off before the week even started. She needed someone who couldn't be bought. Someone who lived outside the polite, sanitized rules of corporate warfare. Finch's brokerage was tucked behind a heavy blast door that required a DNA swab to open. Finch himself was a spindly, multi-limbed creature with pale skin and eyes entirely too large for his head. He looked like an insect trying to pass as an accountant. "You are asking for a miracle, Miss Diana." Finch said, his vocal synthesizer clicking and whirring as it translated his native clicks into standard common. "The bounty on the black market is substantial. 3 million credits. Most of the professionals on my roster would rather collect the bounty than your paycheck." "I'll pay 10 million, Diana said. Her voice didn't shake. She dug her fingernails into her palms to make sure of it. "Half now half when I successfully reach the core parliament to testify and freeze the company assets." Finch's oversized eyes blinked independently. 10 million, a king's ransom. He tapped a long, double-jointed finger against his desk. "I have a few elite options. A squad of synthetics. Emotionless. Cannot be bribed. Synthetics can be hacked. My uncle controls the tech sector. No. A pair of veteran Glisa heavy infantry. They carry portable plasma shielding. They're too big. They draw attention. I need someone who can move with me, blend in, and keep me breathing." Finch leaned back his chair, groaning under his awkward weight. He looked past her toward the darkened observation window that looked out over the mercenary holding pens. "There is one, but I must warn you, he is not a civilized creature. I don't need civilized. I need alive." Finch punched a code into his terminal. The glass cleared. In the room beyond, several mercenaries were sparring, gambling, or polishing high-tech energy rifles. But Finch's spotlight fell on a single figure sitting in the far corner. He didn't look like much. He was bipedal mammalian, completely lacking in natural armor. No scales, no exoskeleton, no venom spurs. He wore faded denim-heavy boots and a scuffed leather jacket over a plain gray shirt. His skin was pale, marked with a faint dusting of hair, and his face was utterly flat. He wasn't doing anything. Just sitting at a table drinking a glass of plain tap water, staring at the door. "A human," Finch whispered the synthesizer, dropping an octave. "His name is Gideon." "He looks small," Diana noted. He was barely taller than her, and while his shoulders were broad, He lacked the sheer mass of the alien mercs around him. Do not let his lack of volume deceive you, Finch warned. Humans hail from Earth. It is a Class 9 Deathworld. Their biology is a nightmare of redundant systems and hyper-dense muscle tissue. They evolved in an environment that actively attempts to kill them every solar cycle. Is he loyal? He operates on a primitive pack bond mentality, Finch said, waving a hand vaguely. Once he accepts a contract, he views the client as part of his tribe. He will not break a contract, but he is abrasive, paranoid, and excessively violent. Bring him in. A minute later, the heavy door slid open. The human walked in. His footsteps were completely silent, which unnerved Diana immediately. Every other species with his body density stomped. Gideon moved like a ghost. He didn't look at Finch. His pale green eyes swept the room, pausing for a fraction of a second on the ventilation grate, the blind spot behind the desk, and finally on her. Up close, Diana saw the wear and tear. A jagged white scar cut through his left eyebrow. His knuckles were thick and heavily calloused. Finch says you need a shadow, Gideon said. His voice was gravelly quiet and carried no inflection. I need to live long enough to reach the core parliament, Diana corrected. I have a 10 million credit budget, half up front. Gideon didn't flinch at the number. He just looked at her high-heeled boots, her silk dress, and the glowing data pad in her hand. You're a soft target. You're broadcasting your location. Your footwear prevents you from running, and your clothes offer zero ballistic protection. Diana felt a flush of anger. I am a corporate executive, not a soldier. If you want to stay a breathing executive, you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, Gideon replied, stepping closer. She noticed the faint smell of him, like iron old coffee and unscented soap. I control where you sleep, what you eat, and who you talk to. I confiscate all your communication devices. You don't sneeze without my clearance. That sounds like a prison. It sounds like a pulse, he countered flatly. Deal. Diana looked into his eyes. There was no greed there, no excitement, just a cold, calculating certainty. Deal, she said. Diana's penthouse in the upper districts of Prime City was a fortress, or so she thought. It occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass and steel spire. It possessed a dedicated AI security network, biometric locks on every door, and auto-targeting stun turrets mounted in the ceiling. She paid millions for the peace of mind it offered. Gideon dismantled that peace of mind in less than 20 minutes. The moment the elevator doors chimed open, he didn't relax. He drew a heavy, matte black projectile weapon from a shoulder holster. It wasn't an energy pistol. It was a kinetic firearm. It shot heavy chunks of lead at supersonic speeds. A barbaric weapon. He moved through her home in a fluid sweeping motion, checking corners, closets, and the spaces under the heavy furniture. When he finally cleared the apartment, he walked over to the central control terminal on the wall. Without a word, he pulled a small pry bar from his jacket, jammed it under the polished silver casing of the terminal, and ripped the faceplate off the wall. "What are you doing?" Diana shrieked, watching sparks shower onto the imported rug. Gideon reached into the exposed wiring and ripped out a handful of optical cables. The lights flickered, and the soothing blue hum of the AI overseer died instantly. The automated turrets in the ceiling sagged lifeless. "Your security system is tied to the city's grid," Gideon said, tossing the cables onto the floor. "Whoever wants you dead has enough money to buy the grid operators. Your AI wasn't a shield. It was a homing beacon. Now it's dead. Those turrets were my first line of defense. Those turrets can be remotely overridden to shoot you in the back of the head. He turned away from the wall and walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the metropolis. Gideon reached up, gripped the heavy velvet drapes, and yanked them shut. The room plunged into gloom. "Hey, I like the view. So does the sniper sitting on the roof of the commercial tower, 2 miles away," he replied, turning on a small, low-wattage desk lamp. "Glass is a liquid, Diana. It vibrates. A laser microphone bounced off that window can pick up everything you say, and a high-velocity tungsten round will go through it like it's tissue paper." Diana slumped into a leather armchair, rubbing her temples. "You're suffocating me, Gideon. The probability of a sniper—" "I don't deal in probabilities," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I deal in possibilities. Where I come from, if you rely on statistics to keep you safe, something eats you." He walked over to her bedroom. Diana followed him, thoroughly exhausted. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the massive circular bed pushed up against the far wall. He walked over, braced his legs, and shoved. The bed groaned, sliding across the floor until it sat dead in the center of the room, exposing a wide berth around it. "What now?" she asked, throwing her hands up. "Never sleep against a shared wall," he said, checking the locks on the heavy mahogany door. "A shaped breaching charge on the other side of that drywall will turn your organs to jelly before you even wake up. In the center of the room, you have a buffer. It gives me an extra 2 seconds to react." Diana stared at him. "How do you live like this? How does an entire species live in a constant state of terror?" Gideon stopped. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the flat, dead look in his eyes shifted. There was something ancient and heavy behind them. "It's not terror," he said softly. "It's respect. Earth taught us that the universe doesn't care if you're rich or smart or important. The universe just wants to break you down and recycle your carbon. We survive because we never forget that. Paranoia is a gift. It keeps the blood pumping." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy piece of metal. It was a dumb phone. No holographics, no holonet access. Just a secure, encrypted radio frequency. He tossed it onto the mattress. "Tomorrow we don't take your hover limo. We take a ground car, treads, heavy plating. The route will be random. You don't tell your assistant. You don't tell your board. You wake up, you follow my lead, and maybe you live to see the sunset." He didn't wait for a response. He walked out of the bedroom, pulling a single wooden chair from the dining table. He placed it facing the front door, sat down, and rested his kinetic pistol on his lap. He didn't close his eyes. They lasted exactly 48 hours before the violence found them. Diana had a mandatory check-in at a neutral corporate bank. The bylaws required her physical thumbprint on a ledger to prevent the board from legally declaring her deceased and liquidating her assets. She couldn't skip it. Gideon had hated the idea. He had argued against it for an hour, but the law was the law. If she didn't sign, she lost the company anyway. The bank was located in the commercial sector. Pristine white marble, soaring ceilings, and heavily armed private security. It felt safe. The air was cool and smelled of expensive sanitizers. Diana finished pressing her thumb to the biometric scanner at the teller's desk. The light flashed green. A heavy weight lifted off her chest. "Done," she breathed, turning to look at Gideon. He was standing 5 feet behind her. He wasn't looking at the teller. He wasn't looking at the armed guards by the doors. He was staring at a massive decorative water feature, a wall of cascading water 50 feet away. His head tilted just a fraction. A strange primal tension gripped his body. His jaw locked. "Gideon," she asked. Diana didn't hear a sound. There was no alarm, no shouts. Gideon simply lunged. He didn't grab her arm or try to guide her. He hit her like a runaway freight train. A solid mass of muscle and bone slammed into her ribs. The air violently evacuated her lungs as her feet left the floor. She heard a sickening crack from her own chest, a sharp spike of agony tearing through her. They hit the marble floor hard, Gideon's heavy body pinning her down, covering her head. A microsecond later, the world ended. The teller's desk, where Diana had just been standing, simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion of fire, just a deafening, thunderous crack that ruptured her eardrums, followed by a shockwave that threw marble shrapnel across the lobby like shrapnel. A heavy kinetic slug, a railgun round fired from God's new where, had punched through the reinforced exterior wall and vaporized the granite desk. If Gideon hadn't broken her rib tackling her, her upper torso would have been reduced to red mist. Dust choked the air. The pristine bank was suddenly a chaotic nightmare of screaming civilians and blaring sirens. Gideon didn't freeze. He didn't wait to assess the damage. He hauled her up by the collar of her jacket, his face a mask of absolute terrifying focus. "Move!" he barked, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. They scrambled behind a massive marble pillar just as the front doors of the bank blew inward. The assassins didn't bother with subtlety. 4 of them poured through the shattered glass. They were Krell-tall, heavily muscled bipeds with gray skin and 4 arms. They wore dark tactical armor and carried high-yield plasma rifles. They moved with absolute precision, sweeping the room. They expected panic. They expected a stunned, deafened target bleeding on the floor. They didn't expect a Deathworlder. Before the lead, Krell could even level his weapon, Gideon stepped out from behind the pillar. He didn't use a shield. He didn't hesitate. He raised his heavy kinetic pistol and fired twice. Bang! Bang! The sound was barbaric in the enclosed space. The heavy lead slugs ignored the Krell's energy shields, which were calibrated to deflect energy weapons, not solid matter. The first round shattered the Krell's knee, folding his massive leg backward. The second round caught him in the throat. The alien hit the floor, choking on his own blue blood. The remaining 3, Krell snapped their rifles toward Gideon. Plasma bolts seared the air, turning the edge of the marble pillar into molten slag. The heat washed over Diana's face, blistering the skin. Gideon dropped low, his movements unnaturally fast, fueled by an adrenaline response that defied galactic biology. He grabbed a heavy bronze stanchion, the kind used to hold velvet ropes, and hurled it. It flew through the air with terrifying force, smashing into the faceplate of the second assassin. The Krell stumbled backward, momentarily blinded. Gideon closed the distance. He didn't shoot. He crashed into the alien, driving his elbow upward under the creature's jaw. The sound of snapping bone was distinct, even over the screaming alarms. Gideon spun, grabbing the dying alien's heavy combat vest and hauling the massive body upward to use as a meat shield. 2 plasma bolts slammed into the dead Krell's back. The smell of burning flesh and cooked ozone filled the lobby. Gideon leveled his pistol over the alien's shoulder and fired 3 more times. The kinetic rounds hammered into the third assassin's chest, punching through the armor and throwing him backward into the wall. The final Krell panicked. He dropped his rifle and drew a vibro blade, lunging at Gideon with a desperate roar. Gideon discarded the meat shield. He sidestepped the blade with a pivot that belonged in a ballet, though there was nothing graceful about what followed. He grabbed the Krell's extended wrist, planted his heavy boot directly on the alien's kneecap, and snapped the joint backward. As the alien fell shrieking, Gideon brought the heavy steel butt of his pistol down on the creature's skull. Once, twice. Silence descended on their corner of the lobby. The only sound was the hissing of melted marble and the distant wail of sirens. Gideon stood amidst the carnage. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his pale eyes wide and dilated. Blood, some of it, most of it alien, spattered his face and jacket. He looked down at his hands, flexed his scarred knuckles, and took a deep, steadying breath. In the span of 3 seconds, he went from an apex predator back to the quiet, exhausted man Diana had met in the bar. He walked over to her, ignoring the devastation he had just unleashed. He reached out a hand. Diana stared at it, terrified. The sheer raw brutality of what she had just witnessed defied every civilized norm she knew. He had dismantled an elite hit squad with a chunk of lead, a piece of decor, and his bare hands. "I told you," Gideon said softly, his chest rising and falling. "Where I'm from, everything is a weapon." She took his hand. He pulled her up, supporting her weight, as a sharp pain flared in her broken rib. "We're leaving," he said. And for the first time in her life, she didn't argue. They didn't take a hover cab. They didn't take the public rail. Gideon stole a maintenance crawler from the loading docks behind the bank. It was a brutal, ugly machine, all rusted yellow plating and heavy rubber tires. It smelled of industrial solvent and old grease. Diana curled into the passenger seat, gripping her chest. Every breath felt like a jagged piece of glass twisting in her lungs. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a cold, suffocating wave of agony. "Keep breathing," Gideon said. He didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the rain-slicked concrete of the lower industrial tiers. He was driving with one hand. The other was pressed tight against his own side. She looked over. The heavy leather of his jacket was torn just below the ribs, and a dark, wet stain was slowly spreading across the gray fabric. "You're bleeding," she gasped the words, costing her precious oxygen. "Grazed," he muttered. Plasma burns cauterized the small vessels, but the kinetic impact tore the tissue. "It's fine." "You're bleeding a lot." "I've got a lot of blood." He jerked the steering wheel, sending the heavy crawler down a dark, unlit access ramp. The glowing neon of the upper city vanished, swallowed by the oppressive gloom of the maintenance levels. They hit a pothole. The jolt traveled up her spine and slammed into her broken rib. Diana screamed. It wasn't a dignified sound. It was a raw animal noise that scraped her throat raw. Tears streamed down her face, hot and humiliating. Gideon slammed on the brakes. The crawler skidded to a halt in the deep shadows beneath a massive dripping coolant pipe. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of dirty water hitting the crawler's roof. He turned to her. The violence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clinical, detached focus. He unbuckled his harness and leaned over the center console. "Let me see," he said. She shook her head, pressing her arms tighter against her chest. She was a CEO. She controlled shipping lanes that spanned star systems. She didn't break down in stolen trucks in the slums. Diana, his voice wasn't harsh, but it carried an undeniable weight. If that bone splinters and punctures your lung, you drown in your own blood in less than 4 minutes. Let me see. Diana slowly lowered her arms. Her silk blouse was ruined, stained with dust and her own sweat. Gideon reached out. His hands were massive, stained with dried alien blood, but his touch was shockingly gentle. He probed the area just below her left breast. She hissed in pain. "Clean break," he announced, pulling back. "No structural collapse, but we have to bind it, or you won't be able to run." He reached into the back of the crawler, digging through a canvas duffel bag he had thrown in earlier. He pulled out a roll of heavy gray industrial tape and a thick gauze pad. "Lift your arms." She obeyed, trembling. He wrapped the thick tape around her torso, pulling it uncomfortably tight. The pressure was intense, restricting her breathing to shallow sips of air, but the sharp stabbing pain dulled to a heavy ache. "Better?" he asked. She nodded slowly, leaning back against the cracked vinyl seat. "Yes, thank you." Gideon didn't reply. He pulled a small silver flask from his jacket pocket, unscrewed the cap, and poured a generous amount of clear liquid over his own side. He didn't flinch. He didn't make a sound. He just gritted his teeth, wrapped a sterile bandage tightly around his waist, and taped it down. "Does your species feel pain?" she asked, watching him. It was a genuine question. She had seen him take a blow that would have crippled a heavy worlder, and he just kept moving. Gideon capped the flask. He looked at her, his pale eyes catching the dim light of a distant street lamp. "We feel it," he said quietly. "We feel all of it. Earth biology is wired for agony. Every nerve ending is a warning system screaming at us that we're dying." "Then how do you ignore it?" "We don't. We just compartmentalize it." He put the vehicle in gear, the engine rumbling to life. "Pain is data. It tells you what's broken. But out here, if you let the data dictate your actions, you die. So you file the pain away for later, and you keep moving." He steered the crawler deeper into the dark. She watched his face in the shadows. He looked exhausted. Diana realized then that Finch was wrong. Humans weren't walking extinction events. They were just incredibly, horrifyingly stubborn. By nightfall, they had abandoned the crawler. Gideon drove it into a raw sewage outflow channel, watching it sink into the toxic muck with grim satisfaction. "They'll trace the onboard computer eventually," he explained, wiping mud from his boots. "Water corrodes the circuitry, buys us time." They were walking through the subterranean transit tunnels. It was a vast, decaying network of concrete and rusted steel built centuries ago and abandoned when the city expanded upward. The air smelled of old iron mold and rot. There was no light down here, save for the pale beam of a scavenged flashlight Gideon had strapped to his shoulder. Diana was struggling. Her expensive boots were designed for boardroom carpets, not slippery grating and ankle-deep sludge. She slipped for the 4th time, her knee slamming hard into the metal catwalk. She didn't cry out, but a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Gideon stopped. He turned around, the flashlight beam sweeping over her ruined clothes, her muddy legs, and her pale, exhausted face. "Take them off," he said. "What? The boots. Take them off." He shrugged off his heavy leather jacket and dropped his duffel bag to the wet floor. He unlaced his own heavy combat boots, stepping out of them. Then he pulled a pair of thick synthetic wool socks from his bag and tossed them to her. "Put those on, then put my boots on." "Gideon, no, your feet." "I have calluses thicker than your tire treads, Diana, and my boots are 3 sizes too big for you, which means you'll blister, but you won't slip. Put them on." It wasn't a request. She unzipped her designer footwear and slipped on the oversized boots. They were warm, heavy, and smelled faintly of sweat and ozone, but the moment she stood up, the gripping tread locked onto the wet grating. She was stable. Gideon walked in front of her in his stocking feet. He didn't complain. He didn't even limp. He walked with the same silent, predatory grace, the cold sludge soaking his socks instantly. An hour later, he threw a hand up in a sudden sharp gesture. "Stop!" Diana froze. Her heart hammered against her tightly bound ribs. Gideon clicked off the flashlight. They were plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. "Listen." She strained her ears. Beneath the constant dripping of water, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic clicking. Click, clack, click, clack. It was fast moving along the ceiling of the tunnel behind them. "Tracker hound!" Gideon breathed, his voice barely a vibration in the air. "Synthetic, probably a Veltran design. Follows thermal and chemical trails. It's hunting your blood." Panic flared in her chest. "We need to run." "No," Gideon said, grabbing her arm. "A machine doesn't get tired. You do. If we run, we die tired." He pulled her toward the edge of the catwalk. Below them was a slow-moving river of toxic gray water. "Get in," he ordered. "That water is toxic." "The chemical runoff. The chemicals will mask your thermal signature and burn away the scent trail. Get in, Diana." Diana hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she remembered the vaporized marble at the bank. She slid down the slick concrete bank and waded into the water. It was freezing, a biting cold that shocked her system, and it smelled like battery acid and dead fish. The water came up to her chest. Gideon slid in beside her. He pushed her back against the dark alcove under the catwalk, completely hiding them from above. "Don't move. Don't breathe heavily." The clicking grew louder. It was directly above them now. She could hear the mechanical whirring of its servos. A sweeping red laser cut through the darkness, illuminating the rusted pipes and the black water in erratic, terrifying flashes. The machine paused. The red light swept back and forth, right over the spot where they had just been standing. It chirped a harsh metallic sound, confused by the sudden end of the trail. Gideon stood perfectly still in the freezing sludge. He had drawn a heavy combat knife from his belt. It was 10 inches of matte black carbon steel. He didn't look at the machine above them. He was watching the reflection of the red laser on the water. The tracker hound dropped from the ceiling. It landed on the edge of the concrete bank with a heavy metallic thud. It looked like a nightmare, a skeletal metal dog with a cluster of optic sensors for a face and razor-sharp titanium claws. It leaned its head toward the water, its sensors spinning wildly, trying to pick up a trace. It was 3 feet away from them. Gideon didn't wait for it to find them. He exploded from the water. He didn't yell. He lunged upward in total silence, a terrifying display of raw kinetic energy. He grabbed the machine by its articulated neck, his thick hands finding the exposed wiring beneath the armor plating. The machine shrieked a high-pitched digital scream and lashed out with a front claw. The titanium blades tore through Gideon's shirt, slicing deep into his forearm. Gideon ignored it. He used his sheer mass to drag the heavy machine off the concrete and into the water. They crashed into the toxic sludge. The water churned violently. The machine sparked and thrashed, trying to bring its jaws around to snap at Gideon's face. Gideon drove his knee into the machine's chassis, pinning it under the water. He raised the heavy carbon steel knife and brought it down with devastating force. He didn't stab the armor. He drove the blade directly into the cluster of optic sensors, twisting the heavy steel handle until Diana heard the sickening crunch of glass and circuitry. The machine convulsed violently, its internal battery shorting out in the conductive water. A massive shock traveled through the liquid. Diana felt the electricity bite into her legs, making her muscles spasm painfully. Gideon absorbed the brunt of it. His jaw locked, his neck muscles bulging as the current ripped through him. But he didn't let go. He held the machine underwater until the sparking stopped, until the red lights died, and until the mechanical struggling ceased entirely. He stood up slowly, water pouring off his shoulders. He ripped the knife out of the dead machine and sheathed it. His forearm was bleeding freely now, mixing with the dark water. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his pale eyes glowing in the absolute dark. "Trail is cold," he said, his voice grating like crushed rocks. "Let's keep moving." They found shelter in an abandoned maintenance relay station deep within the sublevels. It was a small, square room made of reinforced concrete, originally designed to house high-voltage transformers. The machinery was long gone, leaving an empty, dust-choked tomb. But it had a heavy steel door that Gideon welded shut from the inside using a scavenged plasma torch, and it was completely cut off from the city's data grid. Safe. For now. Diana collapsed against the far wall, sliding down the cold concrete until she hit the floor. The wet, chemical-soaked clothes clung to her skin, chilling her to the bone. Every muscle in her body trembled. Gideon ignored his own exhaustion. He immediately set to work. He pulled a portable thermal heater from his duffel bag, clicking it on. A dull orange glow filled the room, radiating a dry, desperate heat. Next, he pulled out a small medical kit. He didn't ask for help. He sat cross-legged on the floor, rolled up his torn, blood-soaked sleeve, and opened a tube of bioacrylate glue. He cleaned the deep lacerations on his forearm with an alcohol swab, his face in a motionless mask, and then simply glued the wound shut, pressing the edges of his own flesh together until they held. Diana watched him entirely mesmerized. "You're a machine." Gideon paused, glancing up at her. He tossed a foil packet of nutrient paste into her lap. "Eat. You need calories to generate body heat, or hypothermia will kill you before your uncle does." Diana ripped the packet open with her teeth and forced down the tasteless gray sludge. "I'm serious, Gideon. You don't flinch. You don't panic. The rest of the galaxy sees humans as these berserker monsters. Is that what you are? Just violence?" He finished taping a bandage over his arm and leaned back against the steel door. He stared at the glowing orange coils of the thermal heater. For a long time, the only sound was the hum of the small machine and her own ragged breathing. "Earth is a beautiful place," he said softly. The shift in tone caught Diana off guard. His voice wasn't flat anymore. It was thick with a distant hollow ache. "Blue oceans," he continued. "Green forests, white mountains. But the gravity pulls at 9.8 meters per second squared. It drags on your skeleton every second you're alive. The sun irradiates your skin. The weather patterns can level a city in an hour. The microbes mutate faster than our immune systems can adapt. We are born on a world that is actively, perpetually trying to kill us. He looked at his hands. The calluses, the scars, the crooked knuckles. We aren't monsters, Diana. We are survivors. For 100,000 years, the only way a human lived long enough to pass on their genes was to be tougher, smarter, and more paranoid than the environment. We learned to walk upright so we could see predators in the tall grass. We learned to throw rocks so we could kill things bigger than us without getting close. We are persistence hunters. We don't have claws or venom. We just follow our prey until it collapses from exhaustion. We outlast. He looked up at her. The galaxy thinks we love war. We hate it. We're just terrifyingly good at it because it's the only language the universe ever spoke to us. Diana swallowed hard, the synthetic paste heavy in her stomach. Why are you out here if Earth is your home? Why leave? Because peace is expensive, he said bluntly. Earth isn't a rich core world. We don't have centuries of accumulated wealth or massive interstellar mining fleets. What we have is a surplus of trauma and a high tolerance for pain. The galaxy pays top credit for humans willing to do the dirty work. I sell my paranoia so my daughter can grow up in a domed city back home where the air is filtered and she doesn't have to look over her shoulder. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. A daughter. This ruthless, silent killer sitting in a dark bunker wasn't fighting for bloodlust. He was a father paying a mortgage with his own blood. She looked down at her own muddy hands. She thought about her father. He had built a shipping empire, ruthless and cold, to ensure she would never have to want for anything. He had died in a fire for it. I'm sorry, she whispered. Gideon shook his head. Don't be. Pity doesn't stop bullets. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a battered physical map made of actual paper. He spread it out on the floor between them. Parliament is in the upper Zenith district. 2 miles up, Gideon said, tapping a spot on the paper. Your uncle controls the airspace, the transit lines, and the security checkpoints. They know we're alive, and they know where we have to go. Tomorrow they won't send hired thugs. They'll send corporate wetwork teams. Can we make it? She asked. She didn't feel panic anymore. She just felt a cold, hard clarity. Gideon looked at her. He noted the mud on her face, the oversized boots on her feet, and the way she wasn't shaking anymore. You aren't the same soft target that walked into Finch's office, he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever heard him give. You follow my lead. You don't hesitate. We'll make them bleed for every inch. He leaned his head back against the steel door and closed his eyes. Get some sleep, Diana. Tomorrow we climb. The ascent began in the dark. Gideon didn't wake Diana with a shake or a whisper. She simply opened her eyes to the absolute crushing pitch black of the bunker and heard the heavy metallic clack of a scavenged plasma rifle being chambered. The thermal heater had died hours ago, its orange coils having faded into a lifeless, dull gray. The air was bitterly cold, biting at the sweat drying on her ruined clothes. Her muscles screamed a harsh, localized protest as she forced her spine straight. Her broken rib throbbed a steady rhythmic and dull ache radiating against the tight industrial tape Gideon had wrapped around her torso. Breathing was no longer an autonomic function. It was a conscious, painful negotiation with her own skeleton. Time to go, he said. His outline was barely visible, a shadow moving against deeper shadows. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. They'll be running spectral analysis on the upper levels by dawn. We need to be inside the Zenith district before the shift change. They left the reinforced bunker and stepped into the bottom of the maintenance shafts. It was a vertical graveyard of the city's forgotten infrastructure. A claustrophobic labyrinth of rusted iron ladders, exposed high-voltage conduits, and dripping drainage pipes stretching upward into a seemingly infinite abyss. 2 vertical miles. That was the distance between the toxic sludge of the Undercity and the polished marble of the core parliament. A straight shot upward. It was an exhausting, brutalizing process. Hand over hand, boot over boot, rung over rusted rung. The air grew thinner the higher they went, tasting heavily of burnt ozone, old copper, and recycled carbon. Her hands pampered by decades of biometric styluses, and silk cuffs began to fail almost immediately. The raw iron gnawed at her palms. By rung 400, the soft skin of her corporate life gave way. The blisters welled up tight and hot. By rung 600, they burst. Clear fluid leaked down her wrists, mixing with the dark powdery rust on the metal, turning her palms into a slick, agonizing mess. Diana wanted to stop. Every fiber of her civilized biology begged her to lie down on the nearest narrow grating and sleep until the world ended. The pain was a heavy, suffocating blanket. But she looked up and she saw Gideon. He climbed with a steady, relentless mechanical rhythm. The deep lacerations on his arm, glued together by sheer chemical force, must have been tearing with every upward pull. His heavy boots slammed into the rungs with metronomic precision. He didn't favor his wounded side. He didn't pause to catch his breath. He was a machine fueled entirely by meat oxygen and terrifying stubbornness. She focused on the heels of his boots. She planted her raw, bleeding hands exactly where his boots had just rested, using his upward momentum to drag her own failing body toward the sky. She stopped being Diana, the CEO. She became an extension of his paranoia, a ghost haunting a rusted ladder. They were half a mile from the zenith access hatches when the shaft suddenly hummed. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It wasn't the rattling of a loose pipe. It was the low electric thrum of a localized dampening field activating. The ambient dripping of water abruptly ceased, swallowed by a cone of artificial silence. Gideon stopped dead. He flattened himself against the ladder, pressing a single finger to his lips. Slowly, he pointed downward. Diana peered between her boots. Far below them, the heavy grate they had passed an hour ago had been blown entirely off its hinges. The sweeping, jerky beams of blue tactical lights cut violently through the gloom. "Wet work, squad," Gideon breathed. His voice was a vibration against the iron rung. 6 of them, wearing active camo cloaks. They tracked the plasma torch residue from the bunker door. "Can we outclimb them?" she whispered. Panic spiked in her chest, sharp and cold, entirely overriding the pain in her ribs. "No." Gideon unslung the scavenged plasma rifle from his shoulder. He looked around the narrow circular shaft, his eyes calculating distances, angles, and structural integrity. "They have ascension rigs, motorized grapples built into their suits. They climb at 20 feet a second. They'll catch us in 4 minutes. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I'm going to teach them about gravity." He pointed his chin upward. "Keep climbing. Don't look back. Don't stop until you hit the landing." Diana climbed. She didn't look down, but the sounds reached her anyway. The terrifyingly fast zip whir of the grappling lines shooting up the shaft. The heavy metallic thuds of steel clamps biting into the grating just a few levels below Gideon. Then the gunfire started. It wasn't the heavy, barbaric roar of Gideon's kinetic pistol. It was the sharp, sizzling crack of suppressed energy weapons. Blue bolts of superheated plasma ricocheted off the shaft walls, melting the iron rungs instantly and showering the dark abyss with a terrifying rain of liquid sparks. Gideon didn't fire back immediately. He waited. He let the hunters close the distance. She reached a small grated landing 60 feet above him and threw herself flat, gasping for air, peering over the rusted edge. The cloaked assassins were moving incredibly fast, letting their motorized lines haul them upward. They were nearly invisible to the naked eye, just shimmering watery distortions in the dirty air. But the blue tactical lights mounted on their shoulder rigs gave their positions away. Gideon hung by one arm from the ladder, his boots planted wide against the concrete wall. With his free hand, he leveled the heavy plasma rifle. He didn't aim at the assassins. He aimed at the infrastructure. He pointed the barrel at the massive industrial retaining bolts holding the ladder assembly to the concrete wall directly beneath his boots. He pulled the trigger and held it down. The rifle shrieked, unleashing a continuous blinding beam of white heat. The thick steel bolts glowed cherry red, then a brilliant blinding yellow. They didn't snap. They simply liquefied into heavy glowing droplets of slag. The structural failure was immediate and catastrophic. With a groaning, agonizing shriek of tearing metal, 30 yards of the heavy iron ladder peeled away from the concrete wall. The assassins attached directly to the falling structure by their ascension rigs realized the fatal flaw in their technology a fraction of a second too late. Their tethers designed to keep them secured to the environment had just secured them to a massive falling anchor. They plummeted. The cloaking fields flickered and violently shorted out as their suits' gyros tried to compensate for the sudden violent freefall. Diana heard their shouts sharp entirely, organic, and panicked echoing up the shaft. The screams stretched out, fading into the dark, eventually swallowed entirely by the 2-mile drop. There was no impact sound. Just a terrifying fading echo. A heavy ringing silence rushed back into the shaft. Gideon hauled himself up over the lip of the grated landing where she lay. He dropped the drained plasma rifle, the barrel smoking and glowing dull red. His chest heaved. His face was pale, smeared with thick grease-dried blood and fresh sweat, but his eyes were entirely calm. The mathematics of survival had been calculated and executed. 3 miles a second, he muttered, catching his breath, wiping a streak of black grime from his forehead. Terminal velocity is a bitch. He looked at her bleeding, blistered hands, then met her gaze. We're close. The air is changing. Smells like bleach and money. Come on. The access hatch at the top of the shaft was magnetically sealed. Gideon didn't try to hack it. He pulled a brick of military-grade thermal explosive from his duffel, slapped it against the locking mechanism, and dragged her behind a heavy coolant pipe. The blast was localized, but deafening. The heavy steel hatch blew inward, ringing like a struck gong. They climbed out, stepping from the dark, rotting underbelly of the city into a blindingly bright hallway. The Zenith District was a monument to corporate hubris. The floors were polished white quartz. The walls were seamless, glowing panels of soft light. There was no dust, no shadows. It was sterile, beautiful, and utterly devoid of life. Diana looked down at herself. She was covered in dried, toxic sludge, her expensive clothes ripped and stained black, wearing boots 3 sizes too large. Gideon looked even worse. He was a walking bruise, bleeding from half a dozen minor shrapnel cuts, his heavy leather jacket ruined. They were a virus invading a clean room. "Parliament is at the end of the Grand Concourse," she said, pointing down the hall. "A quarter-mile straight ahead." "Too easy," Gideon said, drawing his kinetic pistol. He checked the magazine, snapped it back into the grip, and racked the slide. The heavy metallic clack was the only sound in the silent hallway. "They know we're here! They're waiting!" They walked down the center of the pristine corridor. There was nowhere to hide. No cover, just long, sweeping arcs of glass and light. As they reached the Grand Concourse, a massive domed atrium leading directly to the towering bronze doors of the core parliament, they stepped out. There were 10 of them. These weren't hired thugs or street mercenaries. These were Praetorians, elite corporate-owned synthetics. They looked human, but their movements were too smooth, too perfect. They wore immaculate white tactical suits and carried heavy shoulder-mounted disruption cannons. Standing behind them, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, was Diana's uncle's head of security, a man named Sullivan. "Diana," Sullivan said. His voice echoed across the quiet atrium, amplified by the acoustics. "You look terrible. Your uncle was hoping you had perished in the lower levels. It would have been cleaner." "I'm going through those doors, Sullivan," Diana said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop walking. Gideon stayed a half step ahead of her, his body angled to shield hers. "You're not," Sullivan corrected, adjusting his cuffs. "The human has done admirably, truly, a fascinating display of Deathworld endurance. But flesh has limits. Mathematics does not. 10 military-grade synthetics against 1 exhausted mammal. The odds are 0. Stand down, Gideon. I'll pay you double her bounty to walk away." Gideon didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at Sullivan. He looked at the synthetics. Mathematics. Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You think you can calculate this?" "Fire," Sullivan ordered. The atrium erupted. The synthetics didn't miss. Their targeting computers locked on instantly. A heavy disruption bolt slammed into Gideon's left shoulder. The impact was horrific. It threw him backward, spinning him around. The fabric of his jacket vaporized, and the flesh beneath charred black. Any normal species would have gone into systemic shock immediately. The heart would stop. The brain would shut down to protect itself from the agony. Gideon hit the polished quartz floor. He didn't stay there. He used his momentum to roll, bringing the heavy kinetic pistol up. Bang, bang, bang. 3 heavy lead slugs punched through the pristine white armor of the lead synthetic. The machine's chest cavity ruptured, sparking wildly before it collapsed. "Keep moving," Gideon roared at her, scrambling to his feet. His left arm hung completely useless, a ruined mess of burned muscle. Diana ran. She sprinted toward the bronze doors, her broken rib screaming, her oversized boots slipping on the polished floor. The synthetics pivoted, their targeting lasers sweeping toward her. Gideon threw himself into their line of fire. He didn't have a shield. He didn't have armor. He just had his sheer, terrifying mass. He sprinted directly at the firing line, becoming an impossible, chaotic variable that their clean algorithms couldn't process. A second bolt grazed his thigh, ripping a chunk of flesh away. A third clipped his side. He didn't slow down. He closed the distance, tackling the nearest synthetic with the force of a runaway train. They crashed into a glass decorative pillar, shattering it into a million glittering pieces. Gideon raised his pistol, pressed it beneath the machine's chin and pulled the trigger. The synthetic's head exploded in a shower of sparks and synthetic fluid. Sullivan's face lost its smug composure. "Kill him! Focus fire!" Gideon used the headless synthetic as a battering ram, shoving it into two others. He dropped his empty pistol, drew his heavy carbon steel knife with his good hand, and drove it through the optic cluster of another machine. He was bleeding everywhere. He was a nightmare of torn flesh burn marks and raw, unrestrained violence. He wasn't fighting with martial grace. He was fighting like a trapped animal, using his teeth, his heavy boots, and his sheer weight to dismantle the pristine machines. She reached the heavy bronze doors. She grabbed the massive handles and pulled. They were heavy, but they moved. She looked back. Gideon was on his knees. There were 3 synthetics left. One of them had a heavy metal boot pressed against his back, pinning him to the floor. The machine raised its disruption cannon, aiming it point blank at the back of his head. "Gideon!" she screamed. He looked up at her. His face was covered in blood. His breath was ragged. But his eyes, those pale green eyes, were perfectly clear. He smiled, a terrifying, bloody Deathworld smile. He reached into his pocket with his good hand and pulled out the detonator for the remaining thermal explosives he had planted in his duffel bag, which currently sat at the feet of the 3 synthetics. "Run," he mouthed. He pressed the button. The shockwave threw her backward through the bronze doors. The world turned into a roaring wall of fire and deafening noise. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sealing the explosion out, leaving her ears ringing in absolute stunned silence. Diana lay on the floor for a long time. The ceiling above her was painted with magnificent frescoes of early spaceflight. The air smelled of expensive wood polish and old paper. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up. She was standing in the center aisle of the core parliament. A massive circular amphitheater filled with hundreds of delegates from a dozen different species. At the center podium stood the speaker, a tall avian creature in flowing robes. Every single eye in the room was fixed on her. The silence was absolute. She must have looked like an apparition. She was covered in toxic mud-dried blood and soot. Her clothes hung in tatters. She smelled of the sewers and high explosives. She was limping, favoring her broken rib, her blistered hands trembling at her sides. She saw him, sitting in the 3rd row of the observers' gallery. Her uncle, his face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He gripped the polished railing so hard his knuckles were white. He had paid millions to ensure she died in the dark. He had deployed an army to stop her. And yet here she was. She walked down the aisle. Her heavy, oversized combat boots echoed against the marble floor. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of survival. She reached the podium. She didn't look at her uncle. She looked directly at the speaker. "My name is Diana," Diana said. Her voice was hoarse, raspy, from inhaling smoke and dust, but it didn't shake. "I am the sole heir and acting CEO of Zenith Interstellar. I am here to report a hostile takeover attempt, the assassination of my father, and the illegal deployment of corporate military assets in civilian sectors." The room erupted. Shouts of disbelief, anger, and shock echoed off the high ceiling. The speaker hammered his gavel, demanding order, but the dam had broken. She turned to look at her uncle. He was already standing surrounded by Parliament security. He didn't fight them. He just stared at her, his eyes hollow. He had calculated every variable. He had run the simulations. He was a man of mathematics and probabilities, but he hadn't factored in a human. 3 days later, the Zenith Medical Wing was a far cry from the subterranean bunker. It smelled of clean antiseptics and expensive floral arrangements sent by sycophantic board members, eager to pledge their loyalty to the new undisputed CEO. Diana sat in a comfortable chair beside a heavy bio bed. The doctors had been astounded. A heavy worlder would have died from the plasma burns alone. A core worlder would have succumbed to the shock. But human biology was a stubborn, ridiculous thing. Gideon was wrapped in synthetic dermis bandages from his chest to his shoulder. His left arm was in a heavy stasis cast, reconstructing the burned muscle tissue. He looked pale, gaunt, and deeply annoyed. He was using his good hand to try and peel a foil lid off a cup of synthetic pudding. "Leave it," she said, leaning forward and taking the cup. She peeled the lid back and handed it to him. "I have 2 hands," he grumbled, taking it. "You have 1 hand and a piece of modern medical sculpture," she corrected. He scooped a spoonful of the pudding, tasted it, and grimaced. "Core world food tastes like wet cardboard. You people have no idea how to use spices." Diana smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks. It felt strange, like stretching a muscle she hadn't used in years. "I'll have the chefs import some capsaicin for you. Set your tongue on fire, make you feel at home." Gideon chuckled a dry, raspy sound that turned into a wince as his chest moved. He leaned back against the pillows, looking out the large, polarized window at the bustling city below. It looked peaceful from up here. Clean. "The bounty is canceled," Diana said quietly. "My uncle's assets have been frozen. He's looking at 3 consecutive life sentences on a penal colony. The board is purged." "Good," Gideon said simply. He didn't ask for details. He didn't care about corporate politics. "I transferred your fee this morning," she continued. 10 million credits, plus a 5 million bonus for the structural damage to your arm. Gideon paused. He lowered the plastic spoon. He stared out the window for a long moment. "That's a lot of money, Diana. Enough to buy a sector on Earth. Enough for the dome." "Your daughter will be safe," she said softly. "She won't have to look over her shoulder." He finally turned to look at her. The hard, dead stare of the mercenary was gone. The pale green eyes were soft, exhausted, and incredibly human. "Thank you." "No," she replied, standing up and smoothing the skirt of her pristine tailored suit. "Thank you. You kept me breathing." She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the biometric lock. She looked back at the small, scarred man in the oversized hospital bed. He had dismantled an army with a piece of lead and sheer, terrifying willpower. "Gideon, yeah. If I ever need to leave the core worlds again, are you taking contracts?" A slow, wry smile spread across his face, tugging at the jagged scar above his eyebrow. "Depends on the shoes you're wearing, boss." Diana laughed, shook her head, and stepped out into the clean, bright hallway. She was a corporate executive. She lived in a world of sanitized rules and polite warfare. But she knew now that beneath the polished floors and glass towers, the universe was a dark, violent place. And if you wanted to survive it, you didn't hire a shield. You hired a Deathworlder. If you loved this deep dive into the terrifying, stubborn nature of humanity in a hostile galaxy, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY tales, grounded drama, and interstellar world building. What was your favorite moment from Gideon's brutal survival run? Drop a comment below. We read every single one. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and stay tuned. The universe is vast, and humans are just getting started.